Chapter 1, October. Eric Carson's eyes snapped open when his internal clock awakened him before the alarm went off. He lay quietly in the dark, staring up at the interior ceiling of the topper over the bed of his Toyota Tundra. Eric looked to his left and read the time on the dimly illuminated, portable alarm clock barely 10 inches from his face. The alarm was set to go off in 10 minutes at 4 a.m. He reached over, switched off the alarm, rolled over to his right, and leaned on his elbow to look at his 10-year-old son. Jackson was still asleep, breathing peacefully, his back to his dad, one bare leg outside of his sleeping bag. Eric leaned over, lightly kissed the boy on the back of his head, then quietly gathered his clothes and, still in his underwear, slipped out of the back of the truck bed. Eric quickly dressed, retrieved the thermos of coffee from the front seat of the truck, poured a cup, and then opened the door of the kennel for his black lab, Blue. Excited to see his master, the dog jumped up and down several times while Eric scratched him behind his ears. Then Blue ran off toward some weeds to do his morning business. Eric noticed some of the other members of his hunting party stirring in their trucks and tents. He leaned against the side of his pickup and looked up at the cloudless sky. Away from the lights of the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the sight of billions of stars never failed to awe him and to make him realize how small and insignificant he was. Once again, he realized that was why God gave us children, to give us a purpose in life. The dog came back at the same time he felt his son stirring in the back of the truck. He scooped food into Blue's dish, and as he was pouring water into the dog's bowl, he heard Jackson jump down off of the vehicle's open tailgate. "Hey, Dad," he heard Jackson say.
"Morning, bud. Did you sleep okay?"
"Yeah," the boy said while yawning and stretching.
"Get your coat on," Eric told him. "It's chilly out here."
"I'm okay," Jackson insisted, noting his dad wasn't wearing one.
"I didn't ask. Now get a coat on."
Jackson grumbled as he climbed back into the truck to get his coat. Eric just shook his head and smiled at the knowledge he had been the same way at his son's age.
"It is a little chilly out here,"
a voice came from behind Eric. He turned to face Chris Givens, his main hunting partner. Chris blew out a long stream of air that was clearly visible and said,
"When you can see your breath that much, you know winter isn't too far off. A few more weeks and it'll be starting. Coffee?"
he asked Eric as he held out his thermos toward him.
"Sure,"
Eric replied as Chris filled his cup.
"Gonna be a nice day today, though. Too nice. We could use some clouds and rain to keep the ducks flying lower. It's been, a couple months since it rained?"
"Yeah," Eric answered.
"The river is pretty much back down to normal."
Jackson reemerged and the three stood by the truck chatting about the upcoming day while waiting for the other 4 members of their party to join them. They were more or less camped in a parking area on a public hunting zone. The parking camping lot was about 200 yards from the Mississippi River, south of Hastings in Dakota County, Minnesota. It was their favorite spot, and normally not too crowded. Dakota County is located south of the Twin Cities metro area. It is mostly rural farming, with the population centers along the northern border abutting the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. It is a fairly affluent second-tier suburb of St. Paul, with great access to both St. Paul and Minneapolis, and plenty of parks and recreation areas. It also borders Wisconsin along the Mississippi, where our story begins in an open hunting zone along the river that divides the nation. There was a nice-sized backwater of the river here, roughly 10 to 12 acres, with a little bit of a current, but shallow enough for decoys. They hunted on a small peninsula that jutted out about 100 feet into the water, which allowed the 6 men to cover the entire area. There was also excellent natural cover, which they could use for blinds. A thick growth of 5 to 6 foot tall cattails had expanded out approximately 10 feet into the river, covering the entire shoreline of the backwater. The other 4 men joined them, and they carried the 3 small boats down to the shore, where they had cleared a small launch area through the cattails. They quietly loaded the boats with decoys, and while Jackson waited on the shore with Blue and Louie, a golden lab owned by one of the older hunters, the men quietly paddled out into the calm water. As they did so, they could hear the unmistakable sound of ducks flapping their wings and lightly splashing the water as they took off in the dark to flee from the intruders. Even with 2 men per boat, it took 6 of them an hour to set all of the decoys in the water in a pattern to attract their game. Shortly after 5:30, they got back on shore, pulled the boats out of the water, and hid them in the weeds. Satisfied the decoys were set and the boats sufficiently hidden, they all hurried back to the parking area to retrieve their shotguns, ammo, and other equipment. They carried these things and small portable chairs out to the duck blinds. Still too early to shoot, the group hunkered down in the weeds underneath several small trees on the peninsula to await the sunrise. This was Jackson's first time out with his dad, and he was determined to make him proud. Eric, Jackson, and Chris covered the left side of the backwater. The other 4 men, including Chris's dad, Don, were to their right. They all had lightweight portable stools to sit on. The ground they were on was dry and firm. There were several small trees scattered about. Between the trees, the normal growth, the cattails, and their camo clothing, the men were almost invisible. Jackson sat quietly, content and happy to be hunting with his dad and Chris, even though he wouldn't touch a gun. He had his earmuff-style noise suppressors draped around his neck while he quietly ate a power bar and sipped water from a canteen. Blue, a superbly disciplined dog, sat on his haunches absolutely still between Jackson's legs. The dog had been hunting many times and was probably the most excited one in the party, anxious for the sun to come up to get the action started. There was a slight breeze coming across the river out of the east, where the sun would rise shortly after 7 o'clock. They could legally start shooting a half hour before the official sunrise, but waiting in the blinds, with the sky full of stars and an almost full moon, it was already light enough to shoot. Every few minutes they would see a dark shadow flit across the sky. A moment later they would hear wings flap and a quiet splash as the ducks began to drop into their decoys. Blue could also hear them, and he lifted his nose into the wind, his eagerness apparent. Gradually, the horizon directly across the river began to turn light gray. Eric held up his left wrist into the moonlight to check the time. By prearrangement, the men had decided to stand and shoot at precisely 6:45, exactly a half hour before the scheduled sunrise. He flashed the 5 fingers of his left hand twice at Chris to indicate 10 more minutes. Eric scratched Blue behind the ears, gave Jackson a brief hug, then shifted slightly to make standing quicker and easier. Listening to the birds come in, he had mentally calculated there must be close to 2 dozen on each side of their small peninsula. By 6:40, the red of the sun was clearly starting to show to their front. At 6:45, all of the hunters looked over their shoulders, nodded at each other, and quickly stood up, as did young Jackson with his ear protectors firmly in place, his hand on Blue's collar. The water exploded as the startled ducks jumped into the air, desperately trying to flee from the sudden appearance of the men with guns. In less than 30 seconds, all 6 guns were empty, with decidedly mixed results. Eric and Chris each scored 2 birds, and a 5th one that they weren't sure which one of them had hit. The other 4 men, all older than Eric and Chris, had knocked down only 3 between them. They were already in a heated argument over who shot what. Jackson released Blue. The dog was off in a flash through the cattails and into the river. He spent the next 15 minutes swimming in and out of the decoys, retrieving the downed birds. Louie did the same on the other side of the peninsula. For the next 2 hours, they sat in their blinds, patiently waiting for their quarry to come to them. One of the older men was fairly good with a duck call, and every few minutes, 2 or 3 birds would be drawn in. Eric and Chris each bagged 2 more, a pair of drake mallards, a male wood duck, and a green-winged teal. Whenever a bird or 2 showed any interest in the decoys in front of the other 4 men, all 4 of them would completely unload their guns at the curious fowl, making the small cove sound like a combat zone. More often than not, the bird would turn tail and speedily fly off, frightened but otherwise unscathed, much to the amusement of Eric, Chris, and Jackson. By 9 o'clock, the sun was heating up the air, the birds were flying higher over the river, and the action had slowed considerably. Jackson, a little bored, though determined not to admit it, had yawned a few times and almost nodded off.
"Hey, bud," Eric said to his son. "Take the keys, go on back to the truck, and lie down for a while."
"No, Dad, I'm okay."
"Go ahead,"
Eric quietly encouraged him.
"It's okay. You're doing great. Besides, we'll be taking a break in about an hour to eat. Go lie down and get a nap in."
Secretly happy to get the offer, Jackson took the keys and started back toward where the vehicles were parked. He had to pee, and at his age, he was a little too self-conscious to do it in front of the others. When he reached the open space between the river and the parking area, he turned to his right and ran along the edge of the cattails until he found a good spot to relieve himself. There was a slight indentation in the ground about 100 feet from the path to the duck blinds. It was an open spot of bare earth, about 3 feet high at the top edge, sloping down about 10 feet into the cattails. The indentation was a semicircle about 15 feet across where the river had washed away the foliage and the water had receded, leaving the dry ground. Jackson dropped down into it and walked up to the edge of the cattails. He quickly finished, and as he was zipping up his pants, he noticed something in the water. It was about 5 feet out and looked like it might be a rag or maybe a doll stuck in the weeds. Jackson was wearing waterproof boots that went up to mid-thigh, so he cautiously waded into the water and began to make his way toward the object. When he reached it, he pushed aside several of the tall cattails and bent over to get a better look. There were some cloth remnants of what could be a small child's pink flannel pajamas, what was left of a cotton blanket, and a smooth white ball with what looked like several strands of dirty blonde hair attached. He reached down, gently rolled the ball over, and instantly recognized it as a mud-splattered human skull.